Well, I've got a couple minutes after, and I've started the recording, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining today. This is kind of a dry topic, and it can be fairly complicated, but I'm going to try to make it as non-dry as I can. Despite that, I apologize in advance for the wall of text slides that are coming your way, because when you're talking about rule changes, it's all words to look at on a screen. So that's unfortunately what we're going to be looking at, but I'll try to explain as well as I can. And then if anybody has any questions, I think we'll probably go ahead and take those as we go through them. So you don't necessarily have to hold it till the end. If you've got a question for me or need some clarification on something, let me know. Most of these rule changes, in fact, I think all of these rule changes really affect, because this is the part of 911 that the Commission directly regulates, is basic emergency service. Most of these regulations affect the basic emergency service provider, but you as the customers of the basic emergency service provider, I feel have a need to know what is in these rules and what the requirements are for the provision of basic emergency service in the state. So I'm going to go through just some of the highlights. There was actually a very extensive rulemaking process, and there was a lot of red line. If anybody has not seen the full red line of that, who would like to see it, let me know and I can send you the actual red line document that shows the difference between the new rules and the previous set of rules that became obsolete on March 30th. So just as a little bit of background, there was an extensive workshop process. So the proceeding number, if you want to look it up, was 22R-0122, T as in Tom. After the first draft of rules were introduced in that rulemaking, and Karina, I will write that down. Karina wants a set of the rules.
Thank you.
And so there was an initial set of proposed rules that were introduced in that rulemaking, and a number of local agencies intervened and provided comments, and it became clear that there was a lot more work that needed to be done on those rules before they could be finalized. So the administrative law judge in that proceeding authorized Commission staff to lead a number of workshops, and we met over several months in those workshops, and it was a lot of work. It was a very intensive process, but and I'm going to give some acknowledgments here in a moment, but I want to thank everybody who was involved in those workshops, because we could not have ended up with the rules that we did at the end, and I think they were a lot better than they could have been otherwise if we hadn't had that workshop process. The new rules became effective on March 30th. We'd hoped they would become effective sooner than that, but it took a lot longer to get the final order out, establishing or adopting the rules. And then, of course, what a regulatory agency has to do in Colorado is then send their adopted rules to the Secretary of State. The Attorney General's office has to give a final decision on it, their final approval of the rules, and then the Secretary of State has to publish them for 30 days before they become effective. So that adds a lot of time into the effective date of new rules. So the purpose of today's webinar is not to tell you everything that changed, because it was extremely extensive, all of the red line. And Karina, when you get it, I apologize for the headache you're going to have after trying to read it, because there is a lot of red line. But I want to just highlight some of the bigger changes that were adopted in the rules. And you know, if anybody, I know there are people on this call who are involved in those workshops. If there's anything else that you think we should mention that I don't mention, we can touch on those at the end. So acknowledgements. I want to thank everyone who participated in the workshops, as I said before, but these were the regular players. CenturyLink and Lumen obviously were part of the workshops. The Colorado Council of Authorities, which included Larimer, Montrose, and Garfield County Emergency Communications Authorities. The Colorado Utility Consumer Advocate Office, Boulder Regional Emergency Telephone Service Authority, CTIA, Intrado, and Charter Communications. Not all of these organizations attended every meeting, but most of them attended most of the meetings, and some of them attended all of the meetings. And I want to give a special thank you to Larimer Emergency Telephone Authority, who let us use their facility. Thank you, Kimberly, for letting us use your conference room in Johnstown for the physical portion of our meetings. And then we had a number of people also attending virtually. So the first thing I want to talk about are definition changes. There were very extensive changes made to the definitions section, which is 2131 of the rules. I'm not going to go over all of them, but just some of the definition changes that I think are more important include an updated definition of basic emergency service, and I'm going to go into these in a little bit of detail in just a moment. A new definition of basic emergency service outage. Believe it or not, we did not have a definition of what a basic emergency service outage was in the past, but now we do. New definition of basic emergency service network. A new definition of a demarcation point, and I'll tell you what that means here in a little bit when we get to that section. And a new definition of a network operations center. And I don't believe I included that definition in a slide, but we had mentioned network operations centers in our rules previously, and we still do. But we hadn't defined it before, so now that there is a definition of that in there. Basic emergency service definition. I have put in bold some of the items that have changed. Not every change is in bold here, but some of the ones that I think are more important. Basic emergency service, we now have that labeled to be abbreviated as BES. So if you hear me say BES anywhere else throughout these slides, I'm talking about basic emergency service. And that means the aggregation and transport of a 911 call directly to a demarcation point with a governing body or PSAP. Previously, we had said to a point of interconnection with a governing body or PSAP, which essentially means the same thing, but it's an undefined term. So now we're using the term demarcation point, and we also define what a demarcation point is in a separate definition. To help make it clearer what exactly we're talking about. So to a demarcation point with a governing body or PSAP, regardless of the technology used to provide the service. The aggregation of a call means the collection of 911 calls from one or more OSPs, which is an abbreviation for originating service provider. That means like your Vonages, your Verizons, your AT&Ts. CenturyLink is also an OSP in addition to being a BESP because they provide end user service. So from one or more originating service providers or IASPs, and IASP stands for an intermediary aggregation service provider. That's a provider that aggregates calls from two or more originating service providers and delivers those to the BESP on the OSP's behalf. For the purpose of selectively routing and transporting 911 calls directly to a demarcation point with a governing body or PSAP. The offering or providing of location information or selectively routing directly to a governing body or PSAP is also basic emergency service, meaning that your alley information, for instance, is also part of basic emergency service. And then we have a list of things that basic emergency service does not include. There were a number of changes in here, but I only bolded a couple of the ones that I think were more important. We added this first one, which is the portion of a 911 call provided by an OSP. It's a little bit redundant with item number 3, but we wanted to be very clear that we don't consider the portion of the call provided by AT&T, for example, before it even gets to the EZNet. We don't consider that part of basic emergency service. The portion of the 911 call or services provided by an IASP, the portion of a 911 call from the OSP or an IASP to a demarcation point with the BESP. So in other words, that portion of the call before it gets to the basic emergency service network. The portion of a 911 call after the demarcation point between the BESP and the governing body or PSAP. In other words, once it's inside your PSAP, it is not basic emergency service. And if you have CenturyLink as the BESP handing off that call to a local network before it gets to the PSAP, it's still not part of basic emergency service anymore because it's no longer in, it's past that demarcation point between the BESP and the governing body or PSAP. And then the last item is the delivery of text. What we had before was text calls by interim methods, which wasn't very descriptive. So we made that more descriptive by saying the delivery of text messages to a governing body or PSAP via networks or connections separate from the basic emergency service network. Now remember, this is part of the list of what basic emergency service does not include. So what we're saying here is that if you're getting your text messages by any means other than the basic emergency service network, we're not considering that basic emergency service. And that's to my knowledge, that's how all text to 911 is being delivered in Colorado now, is through interim methods, is what the FCC calls it, but it means that it's coming through a method other than the primary basic emergency service network. That one is very complicated, and I know there's a lot of jargon in there, so I'm going to pause and see if anybody has any questions. Or if I just put you all in a coma with jargon and acronyms. Okay, well, if you think of any later, you can let me know. Then the other definitions I'm going to go over are all new definitions. So this is a new definition that was added, basic emergency service outage, or BES outage. And it means the failure of basic emergency service that prevents or would prevent 911 calls, ANI, or location information from being delivered from the demarcation point between the OSP or IASP and the BESP to the demarcation point between the BESP and the governing body or PSAP. So essentially, for our purposes, wherever that basic emergency service network begins, if there's an outage between where that entrance is to the basic emergency service network to the point where the call is handed off to the governing body or PSAP, if there's an outage between those 2 points, then it is a basic emergency service outage. And you'll notice too that we are still using the word demarcation point. We use that throughout the new rules so that we could make use of the definition of demarcation point that we added. And here it is. So a demarcation point means a physical point of interconnection where the responsibility for a portion of 911 service changes from one party to another. It includes the point of interconnection between the BESP and the OSP, IASP, or other BESP for the purpose of selectively routing and transporting 911 calls directly to a demarcation point with a governing body or PSAP. It includes the point of interconnection mutually agreed upon in writing by the BESP and each governing body or PSAP with primary responsibility for dispatching first responders to the caller's location. So we did kind of a no-no here in definition land where we used the defined term in the definition itself, but then that last sentence kind of gives you the idea of what we mean by the demarcation point with a governing body or PSAP. And one thing you might notice is where it says or other BESP, our rules do not preclude us from ever having more than one BESP. We've always just only had one BESP, but there is the possibility that at some point in the future there could be more than one BESP. So the demarcation point also includes wherever one BESP is handing off calls to another. So if you have one BESP receives the call, but it has to be delivered to a PSAP that is served by another BESP, there will be a demarcation point between those two BESPs for handing off those calls. BES network, or basic emergency service network, means the portion of the 911 call path that begins at the demarcation point between an OSP or IASP and a BESP and ends at the demarcation point between a BESP and a governing body or PSAP to provide basic emergency service. So the reason why we did this, even though it seems redundant with some of the other definitions, is because we use the term basic emergency service network a number of times throughout the rest of the rules. So we wanted to make sure it was clear what we meant by that is the portion of the network that is considered basic emergency service or the basic emergency service network. And like I said, there were a lot more changes to the definitions, so I don't want to give the impression that that's all that was changed, but those were some of the more impactful changes, I think, because they were used so much throughout the rest of the rules. But if you want to see a full list of all of the changes to the definition section, I can send you a copy of the red line, just like Karina requested. So if anybody else wants that, probably the best way to be to send me an email and let me know that you would like a copy of that. There were some changes to outage requirements that I think PSAPs need to be aware of. The first is that is in the section that lists what BESPs have to include in a notice to a PSAP in the event of an outage. So we already had a requirement that the BESP has to notify PSAPs if there is an outage of the basic emergency service network. But now that list of things that have to be included in that notification include interim measures taken to route 911 calls to alternate PSAPs or other locations. So if the BESP is doing anything to route 911 calls to another PSAP, they should tell you that in the notification to your PSAP of the outage. Estimated time of repair. Now, realistically and practically, they may not always have an estimated time of repair upon the first notification, but what they could do is put in the outage notification the estimated time of repair is unknown or to be determined. But if they have updates to that, if they have an estimated time of repair when they provide updated notices to you, that should be included as the estimated time of repair, so that the PSAPs aren't left out there wondering how long this is going to last. And of course, it is only estimated, so if situations change or they find out that the cause of the outage is different than what they originally thought, that could change, but it's to give you at least something to work with on how long the outage might last. The other thing that was added has to do with following the restoration of an outage. Now, this was in our rules before, that a PSAP or governing body could request from the BESP. They could ask the BESP, hey, we had this outage, the outage has been restored. Did anybody try to call 911? Do you have records of anybody trying to call 911 who couldn't get through because of the outage? Now that is no longer on the PSAP or governing body to request it. It is on the BESP to let you know. So now, following restoration of an outage, the BESP shall notify each affected governing body or PSAP whether callback numbers are available for calls that were made to 911 but could not be delivered due to the outage. Now, I do want to say that the way most outages occur, most people who try to call 911 won't ever reach the EZNet. And if that's the case, then there won't be necessarily any record in the BESP's systems that number tried to call 911. However, there are some types of outages where that could be the case, that calls could get through to the selective router or the EZNet equivalent of the selective router, but could not reach the PSAP, in which case the BESP will let you know following the restoration of the outage whether those numbers exist. And if available, those numbers must be provided to the governing body or PSAP within 2 hours of the restoration of service. So what would you do with those numbers if you had them? Well, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but one thing you could do would be to call those numbers and say, hey, you tried to call 911. There was an outage, so you couldn't get through. We're just calling to make sure that you're okay. And if there was an emergency, if you still need assistance, if you still need a response. Again, that's not a comfortable conversation that anybody wants to have, but it's better than not checking up on those numbers if they exist somewhere, and potentially not responding to somebody who still needs help. And then finally, on the outage requirements, in the event of a basic emergency service outage that lasts more than 4 hours in duration, or 12 hours in duration if the outage is due to a fiber cut, the BESP shall provide a billing credit for the time that service was interrupted. And the credit must be provided within 2 billing cycles. So right now, there is already a requirement in the tariff that is similar to this. It has a few more conditions on when it would become effective. But now it's in the rules that if there is a basic emergency service outage that lasts more than 4 hours, or 12 hours if it's due to a fiber cut, then the BESP shall provide a billing credit for the time that service was interrupted. The billing credit will be proportional to the number of hours in the billing cycle. So it's generally not going to be a whole heck of a lot of money. But the idea here is to provide an incentive for repairing basic emergency service outages as quickly as possible. And it's also under the principle of the matter, which is that a PSAP should not have to pay for service that they did not receive due to an outage. You'll notice the difference between the 4 hours and 12 hours, and simply because restoring an outage that was caused due to a fiber cut takes a lot more time, generally speaking. So there's more time given there before the billing credit requirement kicks in. And it says within 2 billing cycles, so it won't necessarily be on your next bill, but it might be on the bill after that, that the credit would appear. We added a whole new section So this was probably one of the bigger changes that we made in the document or in the rules. Section 2137 was added, which outlines minimum requirements for what must be included in a basic emergency service tariff. Previously, there were some requirements of what has to be included in a tariff in Section 2134, which is the section that outlines how to apply for a basic emergency service provider certification. But we wanted to create a section that creates that removes any ambiguity regarding what needs to be included as a basic floor of what needs to be included in a basic emergency service tariff. These first two, you'll see there's some bolded words there because they only kick in if it's feasible to do so, which means that we might not see those right away when CenturyLink files a new tariff to comply with this new rule. But when feasible, the BESP should include in its tariff the ability to transfer 911 calls to 10-digit lines without additional long-distance charges. And from the workshops, what we were thinking about here were those times, especially for PSAPs that have service areas that border with other states. If you have to transfer a 911 call to an admin line of a PSAP across that state line, you shouldn't have to pay long-distance charges to do that. And because that's something that you have to do on a fairly regular basis, and we want you to, obviously you have to do it to get that caller to a PSAP that can actually provide a response to them. Similarly, 2137A5 says, if feasible, the ability to transfer 911 calls to a PSAP in another state with location information without additional long distance charges. So what we're thinking about there is at some point in the future, hopefully fairly soon in the future, we would like it to be possible to transfer 911 calls across state lines to neighboring states as a 911 call and not just transferring it to an admin line. An example that sort of brought the issue up was counties along the border with Kansas. Kansas is an AT&T state, so they have an AT&T EZNet in Kansas. And you would think that with the NENA I3 standard, it should be possible to transfer a 911 call from one EZNet to another. It's not possible yet, but when it does become possible, there should not be an additional charge for that, because we want PSAPs to be incentivized to transfer that call as a 911 call so that the location information will go with the 911 call and not be lost by transferring it to a 10-digit line. And if there's an additional fee for transferring it as a 911 call, then that would disincentivize that practice. So those two are contingent on when it becomes feasible to do those things, but those are included. 2137A9, just a moment. 2137A9 states that a description of the internal schedules for testing, monitoring, maintaining, and replacing all equipment and electronics that will be used to provide basic emergency service should be included in the basic emergency service tariff. Now, it doesn't go into any more detail as to what that means or what that would look like. So, when CenturyLink files a new tariff to comply with this rule, it will be up to commission staff as well as any other interveners to, look at what they put in there and decide whether for themselves whether they think that what was included to fulfill this requirement actually fulfills this requirement. And then it might be up to an administrative law judge to make that decision as to whether what they included meets this requirement or not. And 2137A12 says that there should be included in the tariff non-recurring charges for one-time costs, such as installation of equipment or change orders related to the delivery of basic emergency service. Those must be listed separately in the tariff unless they're included in the monthly recurring charges. And an example of what I'm thinking of what we were thinking about here is that when the EZNet was implemented, a number of PSAPs had phone equipment that was not capable of receiving calls in IP format. So they had to have what was called a PSAP gateway module installed. NENA calls it a legacy PSAP gateway, but it's the same thing. And we know that someday they're going to upgrade or replace their phone system with one that does handle IP calls, because you won't be able to buy phone systems that don't anymore. So when that happens, that PSAP gateway module will have to be removed, and CenturyLink charges for that. but that charge is not listed anywhere in the tariff. And the principle here is that there should never be any surprise charges. There should always be a list somewhere in the tariff where you can go and say, okay, if I have to do this thing that's going to incur a one-time charge, this is how much that one-time charge is going to be. Similarly, 2137A13 says that terms of service or terms of payment for invoices for basic emergency service must be stated, including late fees. And I know I've heard from PSAPs in the past who've stated that they incurred late fees from CenturyLink. Those late fees are not listed anywhere in the tariff. And again, this goes back to the principle of there should never be any surprise charges. Those should always be listed because a PSAP obviously has to purchase basic emergency service. Right now, there's only one company providing it and one tariff to purchase it off of. So that tariff should include all costs that could potentially be incurred by a PSAP so that there are no surprises. Now you'll notice I did not go all the way 1 through 13. I started with 4, we did 5, 9, 12, and 13. That's because the other items listed that have to be included in a basic emergency service tariff are things that are already in CenturyLink's basic emergency service tariff. So I only included the things here that are new, but if you want to see the full list, again, you can get a copy of the rules, the new rules, because this is a new section, or the red line document that I can send you, and it'll show all of the things that were included. The rules say that the tariff has to be, a tariff amendment has to be filed to comply with this section within 180 days of the effective date of the rules, and that puts the date at September 26th. So sometime between now and September 26th, including September 26th, CenturyLink will need to file a tariff amendment that includes at least these 3 items that are not contingent on the feasibility item, but if feasible, potentially all 5 of these items. And I'm sorry, I don't know why my voice is so rough today. Another new requirement in 2134, so 2134 is the section that says what a company has to do to file for a basic emergency service provider certification from the Commission. 2134E now requires that active BESPs, meaning basic emergency service providers that are actually providing basic emergency service to PSAPs and governing bodies, must refresh parts of their BESP certification application every 2 years. And the actual rule lists the specific pieces of information that have to be included in that update that comes every 2 years. But among that information that the BESP is required to provide every 2 years is a description and visual representation of the major components of and 911 call flow through the applicant's proposed basic emergency service network. So this could potentially be a network diagram. It could be a map of transport links throughout the state. It is left a little vague, and I think we left it a little vague on purpose so that we weren't trying to nail down something before we actually saw an example of it. But again, that will be something that, once this is filed, Commission staff and any interveners that potentially want to look at it may have some opinions as to whether or not it actually meets this requirement. Somewhat of an oversight, I think, on our part is that we did not say when this new requirement takes place. So it says that it has to be done every 2 years, but it doesn't say when the first one is due. So I'm going under the assumption that sometime this year, CenturyLink will file a report or a updated BESP application just to include those sections that are required in the new rule. And that will start the 2-year cycle, that every 2 years after that, they have to update that information. If we don't get that this year, then we'll have to readdress this because we didn't put a start date in here. But my hope is that we won't need to put a start date in there, that CenturyLink will file it sometime this year, and that will start that every 2-year cycle. Big new change is the new outage investigation process. So there's a whole new paragraph in 2143. 2143 has to do with outages and responses to outages. 2143K creates a new informal outage investigation process. If you are a member of the outage committee or you've attended outage committee meetings in the past, it may be fairly similar to you because this process is similar to the outage investigations that were previously conducted by the outage committee of the task force with some differences. So I'm just going to highlight some of the differences. And the first difference is that it has to be conducted by commission staff. So the new rule directs commission staff to investigate the outages. It doesn't mean that the outage committee can't also investigate outages, but commission staff is required to do so. It is restricted, however, to apparent basic emergency service outages. And sometimes we'll start investigating an outage in the outage committee, thinking it's a basic emergency service outage, and then determine that it's not. Or maybe we don't know if it's a basic emergency service outage, and we find out through the investigation process that it is. But because the commission only regulates basic emergency service, we don't regulate any other part of the 911 call flow. We can only do investigations of outages that we think are basic emergency service outages. And there can sometimes be differences of opinion as to whether an outage constitutes a basic emergency service outage or not. But it will be, it'll be up to, because it's commission staff that has to do these outage investigations, it'll be our judgment first as to whether we think that it could be a basic emergency service outage, which could start that investigation. The BESP is required to respond. So CenturyLink has always responded to outage investigations from the outage committee, but they weren't technically required to do so. It was a completely voluntary process because there was nothing in the rules requiring the BESP to respond to outage investigations or participate in outage investigations. But under 2143K, the BESP is required to respond to the outage investigation and answer questions. There will be deadlines for responses. Extensions can be granted, but the extensions have to be reasonable, and there has to be some cause for the extensions to be granted. So the idea here is that hopefully the investigations will move along more quickly and more efficiently than outage investigations do through the outage committee, because again, the outage committee can't compel an answer. So if it takes a long time for CenturyLink to answer, then there's not really a whole lot that can be done about that. But deadlines are set in 2143K that will help hopefully move those investigations along more rapidly. Any of the parties involved and the task force, probably through the outage committee, can provide responses to the final report. So first of all, the outage committee is not cut out entirely from this process. So once the outage investigation is initiated, a copy will be sent to the affected governing bodies or PSAPs, and a copy will also be sent to the outage committee. And what we're doing is we're sending it to them to see if they have any additional questions. So the initial copy of it will have the questions that I came up with as commission staff, but then we're soliciting any other questions that you, as the stakeholders, would like to see answered as part of the investigation. And then it's sent after that, it's sent to CenturyLink for a response. At the conclusion of the investigation, any of the parties involved, including CenturyLink, can provide responses to the final report. So if you don't agree with the conclusions that commission staff came up with as part of the investigation, you have the ability to add your interpretation or your opinion regarding the outage to that report. And then the final report will be filed with the commission. We've already opened a proceeding, a miscellaneous proceeding to file that, and any documents that go with it. The final report will also document any non-compliance with commission rules or the BESP's tariff. So if commission staff, through its investigation, if in commission staff's opinion, any violations of commission rules occurred, or if any violations of the stipulations in the tariff occurred, those will be listed in the final report. And that's quite an abbreviation of that process. So I don't know if anybody from the workshops would like to add to that at all, but I wanted to cover just some of the basic things that were different between the outage committee's investigation process and the new commission staff investigation process. Or if anybody has any questions. I've put you all to sleep already. My dulcet, raspy tones today. put you to sleep. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I just emphasize that I think it's always very helpful when the PSAPs and authorities that suffer an outage participate in the outage investigation, so that we're getting a more full information regarding the facts as perceived by the PSAP and by the provider.
Yeah, Joe, I agree with that entirely. A lot of times there are questions we just can't answer without the participation of the PSAP that was involved in the outage, because they're the ones who experienced it and know probably better than anyone else what the timeline of events were and how the outage manifested or presented itself to the PSAP. So very good point. There is a new, this is probably actually, I mentioned this was a big deal, the new outage investigation process. This is probably the biggest deal, the biggest change in the new rules. And that is that there is now a requirement that the BESP file what's called an improvement plan with the commission, outlining improvements that it wishes to make to the basic emergency service network, how much those improvements will cost, and propose an additional charge to include in its tariff to pay for those improvements. The idea here is that, we've always wanted, we've always seen that there are single points of failure in the basic emergency service network. There are points in CenturyLink's network delivering 911 calls to PSAPs where a single fiber cut could result in an isolation event, which means that 911 calls can't get to a PSAP. But because the tariff is cost-based, if we required CenturyLink to make improvements to their network to resolve those single points of failure, then those costs would be passed on to you. CenturyLink would be within its rights then to increase its pricing in the tariff, and you would end up having to pay it. What this does is it provides an avenue, it provides a mechanism for the commission to say, okay, we agree that you should improve these parts of your network, and we agree with your proposed cost for how much it's going to cost to improve those parts of the network, and we're going to provide you with a funding mechanism to pay for it. Following a deliberative process, then, the commission may approve the plan. They can approve it in part or in whole. So if there's parts of the plan they like, if there's parts of the plan they don't, the final version of that could be some combination of those things. And an additional charge will be approved to be added to the tariff. And then CenturyLink will be required to file an amendment to the tariff to include that new charge. It will be listed as a separate charge in the tariff per concurrent session. But then what will happen after that is that the commission will take that additional charge into account when it's setting the annual 911 surcharge rate. Because our goal here is not to give you another charge to pay, it's to fund these improvements to the basic emergency service network without negatively impacting your budgets. And the only way we have to do that is for you to pay that charge up front. It will be a charge in the tariff. You'll get it on a bill and you'll have to pay for it. But the commission will include that charge when it's considering the annual 911 surcharge rate. And the idea is that the surcharge rate will then be adjusted to reimburse you for the additional cost that you're paying through that additional tariff charge. Following that, the commission will track how much funding the BESP is receiving through the improvement charge and how much the BESP spends on the improvements. If the BESP is not spending money on the improvements and they're collecting money but they're not spending it, then that additional tariff charge can be suspended. So they're not going to just keep collecting money if they're not spending it on the things that the commission approved. A new or amended plan must be filed every 2 years by the BESP. So every improvement that really needs to be made to the basic emergency service network can't be done right away. And if we tried to create a tariff charge to pay for it all at once, it would be exorbitantly expensive. So the idea is that they will, every 2 years, the BESP will say, okay, we finished the projects that you approved last time. Here's our new list of projects. And here's what we think it'll cost. And here's the tariff amount that would be needed to pay for it. So every 2 years, they will file either a new or amended plan. And that will continue until essentially the commission no longer thinks that it's necessary to have that continue. The general idea, as I said, is to find a way to pay for improvements to the basic emergency service network without requiring those costs to be passed on to the governing bodies. So you will have to pay for those costs through the monthly tariff charge, but then to be reimbursed through an increase to the 911 surcharge rate. And that is all of my slides. And I would especially call on Joe, or I think I saw Kimberly on here. Carl is on here. Anybody who was involved in those workshops, if there's something else that was new in these rules that you think is, obviously we can't cover everything, but you think is important enough that we should include it in this presentation, I would ask you to speak up now. Otherwise, if anybody has any questions over the things that I did cover, I'll do my best to try to answer those. Was it clear as mud? Because I'm not, without seeing faces, it's hard to get any feedback. Kimberly, go ahead.
Thanks, Daryl, and I really appreciate the overview. It is helpful. So I thought it was clear. I didn't think it was muddy. I do have a question. It's not so much as the content, but just from a time frame, from the rules and the diversity plan. Do we have an update on when we can expect that?
Thank you. I meant to mention that. So originally the rules said February 15th. Well, originally they said January 15th, and they were changed in the final version of the rules to February 15th. But then the rules didn't go into effect until March 30th due to unforeseen delays in getting those rules over to the Secretary of State's office and then having to go through their approval process. So the commission issued a decision, I want to say about 3 weeks ago. No, it was further than that. I think it was in late February, saying that for the first edition of that improvement plan, the due date was April 3rd, because that was the first work day. That was the first business day after the March 30th effective date and the weekend thereof. As you can tell, it is now April 5th, not April 3rd, and we still haven't seen an improvement plan. But I did reach out to Tim, and I think Tim is on this call. And CenturyLink is waiting on a decision from NTIA on some grant funding, because that will, whether or not that grant funding is provided by NTIA will make a difference in what types of things or what types of costs CenturyLink will include in the improvement plan. Tim, did I cover that accurately?
Yeah, you did, and I'll add a little bit to it. So we had expected NTIA to rule on these middle mile projects in March. However, as Daryl pointed out, it's April 5th, and we haven't. So I reached out today. It sounds like it may be probably going to be May. It's possible here in April, but I think we know how these things tend to go. So it'll probably be May. So here's what we're going to do. I probably will file still, Daryl, like we were emailing earlier today in the rulemaking proceeding, just to give this sort of update. And then we're going to go ahead and file something here in the next, I don't know, 10 days. And it'll be contingent. And so again, we'll explain this in the filing, because we won't, I'm certain we will not have an answer on our grants. So we will try our best to explain the different scenarios that could occur, and then what we would be asking for from the commission. We'd obviously still need to figure out, what NTIA does, but I expect that they will issue some sort of a decision sooner rather than later, so that we're not guessing all the way through the summer or anything like that. So I do expect some resolution, and then we'll just then go from there as to, do we go for all three of the middle mile projects, even though NTIA didn't fund any of them? Do we only go after the ones that they do fund? So there's some different scenarios that I'm working on trying to sort of lay out and help the commission and others understand the different options. I think one thing that would be helpful, Daryl, and I don't know, I know it's somewhere, but I just don't know where it is exactly, is how much money is being collected and what does a change in the, the penny rate or so of the surcharge collect? Because I think that'll be helpful, at least in how we present these options. Because right now, NTIA, if they were to provide these grants for these projects, they only fund 70%. And so we would only be coming to the state for 30% or so. And I don't want to, if NTIA doesn't grant any of them, I'm not sure that we want to put all three on the back of the state at 100%. So I think that'll help understand, what's maybe some of the limitations are, or what's reasonable to do it at each, at each filing, at each plan proposal. So I'll get that filed here as soon as I possibly can. I have to hire an attorney for it. As you probably have noticed on some of our different proceedings, we have different attorneys working. So it's been kind of an interesting thing where I've got attorneys with different conflicts of interest. And so I'm always sort of shuffling between several attorneys on who can do what work. So I'm working on that to get this file. I could probably use the rulemaking attorney for that one filing, but I can't use the rulemaking attorney for the Middle Mile project. So still working through some of that, but timing wise, I'll get that explanation out as soon as I possibly can, and then follow up reasonably soon thereafter with the proposal for these projects.
Thank you, Tim. Kimberly, you had your hand up first.
Thanks, Tim and Daryl. So, Tim, I know that the plan is still in progress, and you just mentioned the Middle Mile Fiber grant at 70% and coming to the 911 community for that 30%, I believe is what I heard. And I just, I know you're drafting the plan, so I want to put on your radar from a plan perspective, since that fiber is going to be carrying services at our for-profit. I would love to see a plan that doesn't put the remaining amount that you're not getting covered by a federal grant on the backs of 911. Instead of a portion, like a percentage. So just something I want to throw out there as you're considering filing and drafting that plan together on how you're allocating costs.
Yeah,
So,
as part of the rules, we do have to make that assertion of what percentage may be. It's almost assuredly going to be 0% upon construction of that project. And it's possible there could be some small percent of other traffic, but I think it's going to be, we've talked about this a lot. It's going to be difficult up front to say if there's going to be other traffic, but all three of these projects are uneconomic projects. And without external funding, they simply won't be built. So I hear what you're saying, but we'll do our best to provide that information, but without the funding, they simply won't go forward.
Joe, you have your hand up?
I do. I appreciate CenturyLink applying for those grants and not putting the full cost of this on the back of the 911 authority's constituents. I am concerned that, as Brett has said before, we're in an earlier proceeding, given the estimates of the cost for all of the upgrades to eliminate single points of failure in the network, at the amount initially proposed in the initial rules that the surcharge increase would be limited to, it would take something like 20 years in order to complete all of those upgrades. And I think there is enough room between what we're charging and the cap. It wouldn't even get us near the cap to be able to shorten that time to about 10 years. And I'd like to be as aggressive as CenturyLink can be in getting the work done, because eliminating single points of failure will save lives.
Yeah, I agree.
Daryl, you're on mute.
I was telling Tracy she's on mute, and I was the one on mute. Tracy, go ahead.
Oh, there you go. Thanks, Daryl.
Sorry about that.
I just wanted to chime in on the overall structure and concept of the improvement plans, with the thought that the statewide 911 surcharge would cover the charges for any plan that's ultimately approved. And so again, Tim, the goal is not to create extra work, or at least that was not the intent for CenturyLink. But just hypothetically speaking, if there's a plan submitted with or without contingencies in May, I believe by August, Daryl needs to kind of have his arms around what recommendation he will make to the commission for setting the surcharge, the statewide surcharge for 2024. And so we kind of have a crunch time there in that few months for any, if you want to call it adjudication, but I'm going to call it issue scouting and working together to examine the proposed plan and everything. So the next plan, I believe, would be, or an updated plan, however you're going to call it, would be due in February of 2024. So just keeping those timeframes in mind, trying to avoid unnecessary work. And I'm not trying to disagree with Joe's comment about he sees a need for speed, but I also want to recognize that these are very complex issues that it sounds like you're trying to tackle that raise a lot of issues involving a lot of money. And we have to look at alternatives to accomplish the same goal, which involves speaking out to other stakeholders, other options, and things like that. So big picture wise, wanted to emphasize the timing of how it's all intended to work together. And then number two, you know, an option is not always a new build. And so looking at the areas, the 3 particular middle mile areas that you've identified, and what options might be available that are more cost effective than a new build and things like that. We just want to make sure we have sufficient time to do that legwork, to feel comfortable that we're using citizens' dollars and putting them to the highest and best use, and adding on to any grants that might be available, or broadband funds, or this or that. So please know that the goal isn't to make you do busy work, really, in that first plan. So thank you for your efforts, and we look forward to seeing it.
Yeah, of course.
And Tracy brings up a very important point, is that the idea behind this mechanism is that it will be reimbursed to the governing bodies through an increase in the 911 surcharge. But the commission can only set that surcharge rate once a year. We set it by October 1st of each year to take effect the following January 1st. And that proceeding to set the surcharge rate opens in August. Yeah, August. We open it in August, close it by the end of September, so we can meet that October 1st deadline that's in the statute for setting the surcharge rate for the following year. So in the event, because it sounds like this is probably not going to get filed until May, the improvement plan won't get filed until May. You know, I think there's a distinct possibility that it might not get adjudicated in time to be included in the 2024 surcharge rate. And I know nobody wants to hear this, but you know, there's a possibility that the beginning of this process might actually get delayed until 2025, which is unfortunate, but that's where we're at. But we'll just see what happens when the filing gets made, and maybe the adjudication will go very quickly. Any other questions or comments? Well,
Daryl,
it's on.
this is
Go ahead,
Matt.
Matt.
Yeah,
Go
I just wanted to compliment you on a very concise presentation for a lot of complex changes. I think you did a good job.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. And I will thank all of you for coming. If any of you do think of any other questions, or you just want more explanation on anything, or even if you have comments on the rules, it's too late to change them, but we can always change them in our next rulemaking. So I'll be starting the list of things to include in that. Please let me know. Otherwise, I'll just wish you a good rest of your Wednesday and good rest of your week, and hope everybody stays warm. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care,
you.
everyone.